just raise it, and really it's by way of admiration and praise. Your work on sort of presenting what Du Bois did and his contribution to Black feminist philosophy, and specifically describing and reconstructing his bottom-up approach to social transformation that puts Black women at the center of democratic life, doing the difficult work of political transformation, and yet being consistently unacknowledged. I think there's this method that is so important to what Du Bois is doing in Darkwater, and just on the whole of how he's reimagining feminist thought, that is so important, I think, to bring out in the way that you have, while at the same time being honest about his own personal limitations, his interpersonal dealings with Black women. And I know we don't have much time left, but I would love to hear you speak to Du Bois's democratic socialism. And specifically, I was mentioning earlier, I loved your treatment of how he visits the Soviet Union and sort of becomes enamored by it. And there's so much work, I think, here that's important, is sort of bringing out the later elements of Du Bois as his radical political philosophy develops.
I really, really appreciate the question. Let me begin, and I'm going to try to be succinct. I'm a jazz musician, so I often play over the bars, I play through the changes and all that, but I'm going to try to be succinct. With respect to Du Bois's critique of patriarchy, number one, it's important just to acknowledge it. Now, where did he get it? See, I'm more interested in the origins of it. I'm an intellectual historian. Du Bois, when Du Bois's mother died on March 23rd, 1885, he was only 16 years old. An organization, or several organizations of church women, African-American church women, began to help this orphaned boy out. And they're called the Black Women's Club Movement. Mm-hmm. And the Black Women's Club Movement, that is how Du Bois was able to get 2 BAs, 2 MAs, and 2 PhDs by the time he was 27 years old. They funded his scholarship, and that organization was incorporated in 1895, and they called it, wait for it, the National Association of Colored Women. Mm-hmm. Du Bois is paying mute tribute to his surrogate mothers when he calls his organization the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So most people don't actually realize, much like myself, raised primarily, exclusively by African-American women, my grandmothers and my mother. So what about, much like myself, Du Bois is raised, his life begins on deeply and profoundly Black feminist note. So he's seeing the experiences. Now he's still socialized, much like myself, to be a sexist in the American society. So you're sort of, that's a contradiction. And Du Bois sometimes would court controversy. He would actually put his contradictions out there. And I think that there's a kind of radical intellectual honesty that goes on with Du Bois, where some people mask it. Du Bois actually disagrees with himself in print, which is like the hallmark of a real intellectual as opposed to an academic. An academic is just going to hope you don't read that article that they published 30 years ago where they were saying queerphobic and transphobic things. So Du Bois actually disagrees with himself in print. It's something that Jürgen Habermas talks about, conceptual self-clarification. This is one of the reasons that Habermas says that he writes so much, right? He's trying to get clear with himself. Du Bois was a very similar figure, trained in a very similar intellectual milieu in Germany, by the way. So that is the Damnation of Women chapter 4, before I go into chapter 5, but just sort of grappling with understanding that Du Bois is critiquing the racialization of gender. See, to be racially gendered is different than people just saying, oh, woman. No, see, there's a racial signifier. People will say, oh, no, the Mexican woman. They'll say, no, the Asian American woman, if they're talking about anybody other than white women. Du Bois understood that very early on, the racialization of gender, right? We're also grappling then with the racialization of capitalism, the racialization of colonialism. By the time we get to chapter 5, you can see there's this triad of racism, capitalism, and colonialism. In Du Bois's thought, there's no way to delink those by the time we get to his magisterial work, Black Reconstruction, 1935. through which Cedric Robinson argues he helps to inaugurate what's called Black Marxism. This is a kind of Marxism that is as critical of racism as it is of capitalism. It is as critical of racial colonialism and racial capitalism as it is of sort of capitalism in some kind of general sense, as though, I mean, could you even have modern capitalism without racial colonialism? Like, see, Du Bois is asking those kinds of questions that very few philosophers, if any, prior to him, are really asking those kind of, what about the intersection? How is racism intersecting with capitalism? How is racism intersecting with sexism? How is racism intersecting with colonialism and so on and so forth? That's at the heart of Du Bois's entire discourse, right? And for me, that's what's so provocative, intellectually provocative about his work. And then Elvira, that's also why his work remains relevant to this day. Why? Because we've actually named it. We understand that we have identity politics. We understand that there are various forms, systems of oppression that interlock and impact our lives. Sometimes I wonder what Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, what they would make of intersectionality. There seems to be something deeply and profoundly existential about us talking about the ways that we experience, both individually and collectively, racism or sexism or capitalism or colonialism or heterosexism. How does heteronormativity impact even straight folk? They don't realize that they're out of touch with not only out of touch with their humanity, but their sexuality. How bunk might your sexuality be if you're not reading some of this fly Black queer studies or Black trans studies or just queer studies, trans studies in general? I think that there's a lot of subjugated knowledge that heterosexual folks could learn from queer folk, from trans folk. And again, epistemic openness. Notice that I'm underscoring for you, Elvira, that my conception of epistemic openness isn't just with respect to race, class, and gender. Also, the elephant in many rooms right now, sexuality.